Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to give everyone just another few seconds to get logged in and we will get started. All right, welcome everyone to our October school support session. I'm Vanessa Weisford, the Chief Education Officer at the Celiac Disease Foundation, and we are very excited to have an amazing panel of helpers here today for this session. We run these sessions every month in partnership with hospitals across the country. All right, welcome everyone to our Sorry, let me turn the audio off on the recording. Sorry about that. We are also live streaming this to YouTube because we have had so many requests for the recordings. And so this is currently streaming. And as soon as we hit end on the session, the video will be available on the Celiac Disease Foundation's YouTube channel. So you can check it out there, and we'll also have it posted to our social channels later as well, so you can refer back to it. But as I was saying, we have an amazing group of supporters here today. From Boston Children's Hospital, we have Francie Kelly, who will be leading the session today. Francie is an expert in all things celiac at school, and we are very grateful to have her. We also have the incredible Dr. Ritu Verma from the University of Chicago Celiac Disease Center. She's also the president of the Society for the Study of Celiac Disease and also mom to kids with celiac disease. So she gets it from all fronts. We also have Megan Donnelly from the Celiac Disease Foundation, Emily Peikin from the Celiac Disease Foundation, and Lindsay Yeakel from the University of Chicago. So we ask that you please put all of your questions in the Q&A field, and we will answer as many of them as possible. We're typically able to answer all of them, so please just keep them in that Q&A box so we can keep them organized. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Francie to get started.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen so that we can get started with the program. So let me just get that set up. Okay, here we go. So today we're talking about celiac disease at school. Everything we talk about today is in the Managing Celiac Disease and Learning Environments National Guidelines for how to deal with celiac disease in school. These guidelines were developed in collaboration with the Celiac Disease Foundation and 12 pediatric hospitals. They also included educational associations, public and private schools, administrators and staff, nurses, teachers, parents, students. The information in this book, we believe, is the definitive document on how to deal with celiac disease in the school environment. And it's based on researches and best practices in terms of how to deal with celiac disease. And it really outlines procedures for managing celiac disease at school, preventing gluten exposure at school, and setting up a 504 plan. You can download this booklet from the Celiac Disease Foundation website. You also received a copy with the materials that you used to register that you received when you registered for the class. So there are several federal laws that deal with celiac disease at school. The first set of laws deal with disabilities. We're going to talk about the first law is the American with Disabilities Act. The ADA defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. We know that eating and major bodily functions like digestion and the immune system are considered major life activities. Therefore, celiac disease qualifies as a disability as defined by the ADA. In addition to the ADA, we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This section prohibits discrimination at all institutions that receive federal financial assistance that includes schools based on a disability. What that means is if your school receives any kind of federal funding, they cannot discriminate against your child because of their celiac disease. Now, a lot of times people take that to assume, okay, so public schools all receive federal funding, so it applies to public schools, but it doesn't apply to private schools. That is most likely the case, but not necessarily the case. It is federal financial assistance. So if your private school is involved in any kind of government program where they're getting funding, they may fall under Section 504. So It's important to figure out if your child's in private school, to figure out if that school is receiving any kind of federal funding. They might be in a grant program or something like that. Um, and what we're going to talk about today is really reliant on the 504 plan that's based on this section of the Rehabilitation Act. If your child is in a private school and that private school does not receive federal funding, this law does not apply to them. However, most schools want to do right by their kids. And with that in mind, private schools, by and large, will go through a process very similar to what we're talking about today. And they will set up a plan to manage your child's celiac disease at school. They're just not going to call it a 504 plan. So this information is just as relevant to you if your child's in private school as it is to those families with children in public school. So getting back to Section 504, what 504 says is that the educational program must meet the needs of the student with the disability as adequately as they're meeting the needs of the non-disabled student. And it requires reasonable accommodations that do not drastically alter the structure of the educational institution. We also have several laws that govern food in the school environment. First, we have the National School Lunch Act. National School Lunch Act provides qualified students free or reduced cost meals at school. And as part of the National School Lunch Act, if your child has celiac disease, a gluten-free option must be made available to them. It is required by that law. And that actually is like any kind of medically necessitated diet. They have to provide adequate options for your child under the National School Lunch Act. If you're fortunate enough to live in one of the states that has universal school meals, that would be California, Colorado, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, Massachusetts, and Vermont, then whether or not your child meets the qualification requirements under the National School Lunch Act or not, all children in those 8 states receive a free breakfast and lunch at school. And again, in all of those states, if your child has celiac disease, a gluten-free option should be made available to them. The Child Nutrition Act offers financial assistance to schools for equipment that extend breakfast and lunch services. The USDA, as part of that act, is allowed to set uniform standards for nutrition for the nutrition in those meals served at school. And again, under that act, the special diet meals, including the gluten-free diet, must meet those same nutritional standards as that are being required for the other students. The FDA Gluten-Free Food Labeling Act regulates the use of the term gluten-free on packaged food. So if your cafeteria is bringing in packaged foods that say gluten-free on the outside, then those foods must comply with the FDA's requirement for labeling a product gluten-free. So what are the types of plans that we have in the school environment? First, we have the 504 plan, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. The 504 plan addresses accommodations in the academic areas as well as extracurricular activities. The accommodations in the 504 plan allow the child to fully participate in all educational and social activities associated with school. Academic performance is not a factor in determining a child's eligibility for a 504 plan. Your child can be an A student, they can be a C student, they can be whatever. It doesn't matter. Academic performance is not a determining factor. And the plan stays with your child. So as your child moves through elementary school to middle school to high school, the 504 plan stays with them. If you were to move and your child now is in a different school, and even in a different school district, the 504 plan goes with them. Now, obviously, the plan gets updated from year to year because the kinds of accommodations we have for kindergartners and the kind of accommodations we have for high school students aren't going to be the same. But the fact that you have a plan and accommodations are going to be made for you stays with the child throughout school, and that even goes into the college setting. The Individualized Education Plan, or IEP, documents disabilities that affect a child's academic performance. This would be something like dyslexia or ADHD. And the IEP is a plan that says that this child has a disability that's affecting academic performance, and we're going to improve that performance with this plan. And it's going to have measurable goals so that we can see how that child's academic performance improves as a result of the plan. Well, we know that a child with celiac disease does not work at peak academic performance if they've been exposed to gluten and they aren't feeling well. It's not really an impact on academic performance that we can measure. And so this plan doesn't really work with celiac disease because we're not going to see an improvement, a measurable improvement in academic performance as a result of putting a plan into place. That being said, a child with celiac disease is just as likely as any other child to have issues such as dyslexia or ADHD or any other kind of disability that could impact academic performance. And so a child with celiac disease may have the need for an IEP for that other condition. And that's fine. If your child has a condition that requires an IEP, they absolutely should have an IEP plan. The IEP plan is not the appropriate place for celiac disease alone. The celiac disease accommodations should be documented in a 504 plan. If your child needs both, then you need to work with your school on how to work with both types of plans. Sometimes the school will put the 504 plans into the IEP. Sometimes they'll put the IEP accommodations into the 504 plan, and sometimes they'll have two separate plans. But you want to make sure that that you're working with the school to make sure that it works smoothly and that one plan isn't being used and the other plan being forgotten about. You want to make sure that it is a well-coordinated effort if you need both types of accommodations. The last type of plan is the individualized healthcare plan, or the IHP. The IHP deals with medical issues in the school setting. And that sounds like it would be a great place for celiac disease, because celiac disease is a medical condition and we're talking about school. But the IHP is really designed to be used by the school nurse or the health aide. It does not typically offer any kind of formal classroom or cafeteria accommodations. And it's really about this child has celiac disease. They've gotten sick at school as a result of their celiac disease. What do we now do to help address that problem? What does the nurse do? What does the health aide do because this child's sick? Whereas a 504 plan offers accommodations that we hope are going to prevent the child from being exposed to gluten and therefore prevent the child from getting sick at school. So I like to think of the 504 plan as being a proactive plan, whereas the IHP is a reactive plan. What do we do once the child gets sick? And we want to take those steps to make sure the child doesn't get sick in the first place. And that's why the 504 plan is the superior plan for a child with celiac disease and is the appropriate plan that you should be putting in place for your child. So how do you go about getting a 504 plan? It starts with getting your diagnosis of celiac disease, and then you need to inform your school or your learning environment that your child has celiac disease and that you want to set up a 504 plan. Usually that will require a diagnosis letter, something from your physician that states that the child has the condition and talks about why they need a 504 plan and the kinds of accommodations that should be in that plan. When you sit down with the school, you're going to have a 504 plan eligibility meeting. And that is a checklist that the school is going to go through to determine whether your child falls under the classifications in the law that meets the definition for a 504 plan. We know celiac disease does meet that definition. Many schools also know that. That is really a very quick process in a lot of situations where they go through that checklist. Yes, the child is eligible for the plan. And then you're going to sit down and talk about the actual accommodations that you want to put in place for your child at school. The next step here is assigning roles. And this is a really important step. And it really has to do with that meeting when you're sitting down with the school and talking about those accommodations. You want the people in that room who are discussing the accommodations to be the people who are going to be responsible for making sure that those accommodations take place. So, for example, if your child wants to eat lunch in the cafeteria with their friends, then you're going to want someone from food services as part of that 504 meeting. I cannot tell you how many times I have talked to schools about accommodations, And school nurses or school principals or assistant principals or classroom teachers will tell you, oh, they don't have gluten-free offerings in our cafeteria, or the cafeteria can't do something. And what they're really saying is, I've never seen a gluten-free offering on the school menu, or I've never seen the cafeteria do that kind of thing. But they really don't know how things operate in the cafeteria on a very detailed level. They don't know that they've never offered gluten-free buns for hamburgers on hamburger day because they can't get gluten-free buns. They just know that they haven't been there, but it's not only quite possible, but highly likely that the food service vendor that your cafeteria is using to order food from has gluten-free buns as one of the items that can be ordered. So you really need to talk to someone who's from the cafeteria, who understands how things happen in the cafeteria, what processes can be put in place, what processes really aren't possible for them, and knows what options are available in terms of ordering. And your school nurse and your principal or assistant principal are not likely to have that level of detailed knowledge. So really make sure that the people who are in the room are the ones responsible for the accommodation. Another example, if your kid is on a sports team or in the band or on the debate team or whatever kind of extracurricular activity where they get on buses and they travel halfway across your state in order to get to some sort of a meet or match or game or whatever, and they're stopping to eat along the way, you're going to want that coach or that faculty advisor to be part of this meeting to make sure that those stops are happening in places where gluten-free options are going to be made available. So again, assigning roles is really important, making sure the right people are in the room to ensure that appropriate accommodations are put into place. After you sit down with the school and talk about the specific accommodations, you're going to write the plan, it's going to get signed off on, then it's going to get put into action. Every year you need to sit down with your school again to update that 504 plan, an annual check-in. What's working, what's not working, what are the things that, because your child is growing and they have different needs, they have different maturity levels, there's different activities going on, and this grade at school than last year. What are the kinds of things we need to update? Accommodations we need to add, accommodations we can remove. An important thing to note about those annual check-ins is those happen at a minimum. So what that means is that, yes, you do need to update the plan every year to accommodate for your child's changing needs. But at any time during the school year, if things aren't working the way they should with the 504 plan, you can call a 504 meeting and sit down with the school to talk about what's not working and how to fix it. Most of the time, you're going to do that because when you're sitting in a conference room around a table with a bunch of people and you say, well, the school is going to do a certain thing to put this accommodation into place, it sounds great. And it sounds like it makes total sense. But then when you get into the classroom, it doesn't work. So just it just is not what happens in the classroom is not exactly the same as what happens around a conference table. So a lot of times you're just tweaking an accommodation so that something that you thought was a good idea and isn't really working is now a much more smoother accommodation. Other times they are more contentious 504 meetings because you are having an issue with an accommodation not being followed or something of that nature. But again, most of the time, it's just going to be tweaking things that just aren't working the way you anticipated. So what are some of the actual accommodations you want to put into place? I know this is a little hard to read. Don't worry about that. We're gonna get to more detailed explanations here. But this is a reproduction of pages 20 and 21 in your booklet, Managing Celiac Disease and Learning Environment. And this lists all kinds of accommodations. And what we've done is that group that got together to put this book together came up with a consensus of all of the accommodations we think your kids could use. Now, that's all the possible accommodations, not necessarily all the actual accommodations your kid is going to need. This takes into consideration kids in preschool, kindergarten, as well as kids in high school. It takes into many different kinds of circumstances. Your child is unlikely, even if they are, 3 or 4 years old and just starting out in school and going to have a 504 plan all the way through high school, they're unlikely to need all of these accommodations because we've taken lots of different possibilities into consideration. In addition to that, no child is going to need all of these accommodations in any given year. There's accommodations in here for things like um, using Play-Doh or sensory tables as, in the younger grades. You're not going to put that in a 504 plan for a high schooler. We have accommodations in here for the senior prom. You're not going to put those accommodations in there for a kindergartner. So this is over the lifetime of your child in school, the possible accommodations that they will use. They will not have all of these accommodations in any one single year. This is a better view of those pages on 21, 20, and 21 in your booklet. And you can see that we've divided these accommodations into three categories. The first one being classroom or other learning environments, the second category being eating spaces, and the third category being field trip and other off-site activities. A couple of things that's important to realize about these types of accommodations. This three-column format is a really easy way to think about the kinds of accommodations your child needs in different kinds of situations at school. In eating spaces, you may want your child to eat a cafeteria provided meal in the school cafeteria, and that's great. There are lots of accommodations in this column to help you with that process. But if your child is a picky eater, or for some other reason you decide you would just rather have them bring a lunch from home, that's also okay. But don't ignore the eating spaces column, because even if you bring lunch from home, they're still going to be eating in the cafeteria. And so there are going to be accommodations that you need to put in place to make sure that it's a safe environment for them to eat in. Field trips and other offsite activities. Any event or any activity that's school sponsored falls under the 504 plan. So whether it is the PTO Fall Festival, or whether it is a field trip that the kids are taking, or whether it is an 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C., those things do come under the 504 plan. So it's, again, important to make sure that you have accommodations for all of those activities, not just for what's happening in the classroom in your plan. So let's talk about some examples of reasonable accommodations. In the classroom, a reasonable accommodation would be to try and plan all of the learning activities in a manner that is naturally gluten-free. Then there's no issue. That's easy all around. If that's not possible, if there's an activity that really cannot be made gluten-free for the whole classroom, then a gluten-free method of engaging that activity should be provided for the student with celiac disease. And schools should discuss how to make the accommodations with the parents or guardians. And this one can get a little contentious. Sometimes school bristle a little bit at the idea of parents saying, I can help with these accommodations, because it comes off a lot of times. Parents come off with, I can tell you how to do your job. And that's not what we're talking about here. The reality is the kinds of accommodations that need to be put in place to make some of these learning activities naturally gluten-free, or to make the gluten-free accommodation for your child, are things you've already done at home. A lot of these activities are similar to things that you do all the time with your kids. And you've already figured out how to make it gluten-free. You've already figured out how to do that in an affordable way, gluten-free. And you are the best resource that the school has on how to make these activities gluten-free and safe for your child. And so what you're saying here when you're asking the school to discuss these accommodations with you is you are their best resource. You want to help. So it's really important to make sure that you present that in that way, as that you are a resource, that you are helping. Unreasonable accommodations in the classroom would be for you to ask that your child gets an excused absence from school on a given day because you feel like an activity that they're engaging in at school is inherently unsafe for them. No, nothing should be unsafe for your child. The school should be making the accommodations in order to make sure that they can fully participate in all aspects of school life. There should never be a need to ask for an excused absence from class. Another unreasonable accommodation would be for the school to ask for your child to take a study hall or any kind of period where they are separated from the classroom and not engaging in a learning activity. That's not okay. school should be figuring out a way to make sure that your child is fully engaged in all learning activities. For extracurricular activities, a reasonable accommodation would be that the school provides gluten-free food for the child if they are providing food for the other students engaged in that activity. And again, you are their best resources. So they should be willing to work with you to identify a plan so that your child can have access to gluten-free, safe food. An unreasonable accommodation for an extracurricular activity would be for the school to say that the child can't participate by virtue of their celiac disease. That's not okay. Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. I don't know if you all could see that thing that just pulled up on my screen, but I apologize. Okay, so we're going to go here. In the cafeteria, a reasonable accommodation would be that the gluten-free meal should be a hot meal for a hot meal and meet the same nutrition and caloric standards as the meals being served to the other students. Would that does a hot meal for a hot meal mean that there must, the plate that they give your kid has to be steam coming off of it, piping hot? No. It means that it needs to be a complete meal. It means that it needs to be a nutritious meal. It means that it needs to meet those nutrition and caloric standards that are the meals being served to the other students. An unreasonable accommodation in the cafeteria would be for you to say, hey, it's ravioli day. So the school needs to provide gluten-free raviolis for my kids so they're eating the exact same meal as the other students. No. The school needs to provide a safe gluten-free meal for your child, but they do not have to provide a meal that is an exact replica of the meals that's being served to the other students. Another unreasonable accommodation would be for you to ask for the entire school to go gluten-free. Our children do not need to live in bubbles of gluten-freeness. They are free to be in the world with gluten around them and be safe with their celiac disease. And so asking the whole school to go gluten-free would be considered an unreasonable accommodation. Also, asking for separate kitchen equipment, kitchen or equipment for gluten-free food preparation would be an unreasonable accommodation. Now, it's important to note here that the school is required to prepare the meals for the gluten-free meals for the child with celiac disease in a manner that's safe and is free from cross contact. But there are lots of different ways to ensure that that's happening. It does not require that gluten-free meals be prepared in a separate gluten-free kitchen. It does not require that gluten-free meals be prepared with equipment that is dedicated gluten-free. Therefore, asking for that would be considered a reasonable accommodation. But asking that the food is prepared in a safe manner, asking that the food is free from cross contact, that's perfectly reasonable. On field trips, asking the school to engage with you in planning field trips so that you can preempt any kinds of problems that could take place on that field trip. Again, you are the best resource that the school has. Offering to chaperone field trips. If there's going to be food provided during a field trip and there's going to be labels to be read and you have a little one who can't read yet, you may want to be there so that you can look at the labels. And that's a perfectly reasonable accommodation and something to ask for. And most importantly, on a field trip, if the school is providing food for the other students, they must provide a gluten-free option for the child with celiac disease. So what are some practical ways to accommodate the gluten-free diet? These suggestions are based on school cafeterias that are actually out there doing these things. Serving naturally gluten-free meals, focusing on fresh foods like fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, having gluten-free bread or gluten-free buns for things like sandwiches, hamburgers, hot dogs, grilled chicken sandwiches, using cornstarch to bread fried foods, having dedicated fryers so that there's no risk of cross contact for things like French fries and tater tots. If they have Taco Tuesday, using corn tortillas as an option for the tacos. If they have a pizza day, making sure that the vendor that they use has a gluten-free option. If they use a lot of sauces and marinades, make sure that if they use gluten-free soy sauce for the preparation of all the sauces and marinades, then all of those sauces and marinades wind up being gluten-free and they're acceptable for all of the students. Veggie chips, corn chips, potato chips, these are gluten-free. Using squeeze bottles for condiments ensures that there's no cross contact from double dipping of knives into those condiments. And making sure that the school district is working with a food service provider that has gluten-free options um, for the school to order so that you have options for your child with celiac disease. So, what are the responsibilities of the food service providers? The school food service provider must make food substitutions or modifications for the students with a disability. And those substitutions must be based on a prescription written by a licensed physician. So they are going to ask you for documentation that your child has to be on this gluten-free diet. And your doctor should be able to provide that without any issue. That diagnosis letter from the physician should cover the dietary need, as well as that the need should be documented in a 504 plan. And the food service provider is required to offer these special meals at no additional cost to the child with a disability. So, we're used to going into restaurants and being told that there's going to be an upcharge for the gluten-free bun. That's not going to happen at school when you're accessing school meals. You should be paying the same amount as the other families are paying for the meal at school. Earlier, I mentioned that 8 states have universal school meals. If you live in one of these 8 states, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, California, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Michigan, then the school must provide a gluten-free option for both breakfast and lunch for your child that meets the same nutritional guidelines as the foods being fed to the other students. Your school cannot charge you for these meals. So we just talked about upcharging in situations where students pay for meals, but if you have universal school meals, then they can't charge you at all for the gluten-free meal. Again, they have to offer a gluten-free option. The school suggesting that they cannot safely provide food for your children is not allowed. This law does not provide for self-mitigation. The school has to provide a safe gluten-free option for your child. And if your school is not going to do that, then you should reach out to your physician for support, because they can provide the medical documentation that would be required to force the school to do this. In the other 42 states, the rules aren't a whole lot different. The gluten-free meal needs to meet the same nutritional requirements as food being served to the other students. The school cannot charge you anything addition. They can't charge you more than what they're charging to the students receiving the non-gluten-free meals. Again, the school cannot suggest that they cannot safely feed your child. And again, if the school is not offering appropriate gluten-free meals for your child, contact your physician. They can help. Also, the free and reduced cost meals program must provide food for children with celiac disease. That is part of that federal program. In addition to the information about specific accommodations, our guide, Managing Celiac Disease and Learning Environments, provides a lot of useful resources for you. This is just a screenshot of one particular page from that book, but you can see on that page there's a recipe for making gluten-free modeling clay and for making paper mache in a gluten-free manner. And the book is filled with many, many resources like this that you can use to help make appropriate gluten-free accommodations in school. For example, you can do substitutions in sensory tables, art classes, science projects, and cooking with kids. A couple of comments on science classes. A lot of schools, particularly at the middle school level, will use cooking as ways to get kids excited about science. We can put yeast in bread and see how it rises. You can, mix things like oil and vinegar and learn about emulsification and all these kinds of things, which are things that kids can identify with, and then they can get excited about scientific principles in order to hopefully then want to engage in science. It sounds great, but the thing kids things kids know is food. And so a lot of these kinds of projects wind up being food based. So really pay attention to what's going on in science class to make sure that they are using gluten free options for your child if there's food based activities in science classes. Also, cooking with kids. The school should try to use naturally gluten free recipes that therefore it's just safe for everyone and everyone can do the same thing. If they can't do that, they should be making sure that there are gluten free options available. But cooking happens in lots of different places. Sometimes you're talking about a true home ec class where kids are learning to cook, and that's kind of obvious. But there are lots of other places where cooking can take place in the classroom. One of the big places would be social studies classes. In social studies classes, we may be talking about the culture of a particular area, and that part of that culture will be the food, and there might be an activity with, making the food from that culture. So again, pay attention to what some of these activities are that are going on in the classroom, because that might not be just obvious cooking classes. We do have, again, more resources here, helpful suggestions in any of these cooking situations where you can make appropriate substitutions. Here is a sample 504 plan. And with the materials you received when you register for this class, you have a sort of fill in the blank version of this 504 plan. There's a lot of information in the 504 plan about what it means to have celiac disease, that the treatment for celiac disease is a gluten-free diet, what it means to be on a gluten-free diet. And that's going to be the same for every child with celiac disease. There's no reason for you or your school to reinvent the wheel and try and figure all that out. That is already done for you in this sample 504 plan. So the 504 plan starts with basic demographic information about your child. That is stuff, obviously, you need to fill out. Then it talks about the purpose of the plan. That is going to be the same for every child with celiac disease. You do not need to reinvent the wheel here. You can just use what's in this sample document. And again, an explanation of the diagnosis, that that celiac disease is treated with a gluten-free diet, and what it means to be on a gluten-free diet. That's the same for everyone. It is in the plan already for you. The plan also recreates those accommodation lists from pages 20 and 21 in the book Managing Celiac Disease in Learning Environments. This is a Word document, so you can cut and paste the accommodations that you feel are appropriate for your child. You would include in the 504 plan, and the ones that you don't feel are necessary for your child, you can just delete. I would highly recommend that you spend time looking at those accommodations on pages 20 and 21. And depending on the age and maturity level of your child, engage your child in that process if you feel like it's appropriate for them. They know best what goes on in their classroom. There may be an accommodation that you think is really important, and your kid's going to say, that's not really that big of a deal. They do that for everyone. And there may be accommodations that you don't think are a big deal or would be necessary to put in the 504 plan that your kid is going to tell you, oh no, because we do this in school or we do that in school. So I think that would be an important accommodation to be in there. So really engage your child. Also, your child is going to feel more ownership over the plan if they have been engaged in the process. And when you have your sample 504 plan completed, you want to be able to share it with the school. So you should either prepare it ahead of your 504 meeting with the school and send it to them to review before you sit down, or bring it with you so that you can talk about it at the meeting. The 504 meeting is going to go a lot smoother if you're talking about very specific accommodations that you think are important versus, okay, the child has celiac disease, they need a 504 plan, and then silence. Having that list of accommodations that you want ready and available to discuss at that meeting is going to make that meeting go a lot smoother. Okay, why is this not advancing? Okay, I'm sorry, something is going on here. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. Requested accommodations are in the plan. And again, this has used the 3-column format. Classroom and other learning environments, eating spaces, as well as field trips and other off-site activities. The final page of your 504 plan is going to be what to do in the event of a gluten exposure. No matter how well crafted your 504 plan is, no matter how dedicated your school is to ensuring your child's safety, accidents happen. In addition to that, your kid could get sick at school from an accidental exposure to gluten that happened at home the night before. As a parent of a child with celiac disease, I can tell you, been there, done that, where there is, even in your own home, there can be an accidental exposure to gluten. So it really is important to have a plan a part of the 504 plan where there is a plan for what to do in the event of a gluten exposure. Now, all kids are different in terms of how they react to being exposed to gluten. Some kids are going to get a headache and they're going to need to lie down for half an hour in the nurse's office and then be good to go back to class and participate in the rest of the school day. Other kids are going to get violently ill and are going to need to go home. So what goes into this part of the plan, what to do when your child is exposed to gluten, is really going to depend a lot on how your child reacts to gluten. So now we're going to run through some scenarios of some problems that people have run into, some common problems that happen when families have a child with celiac disease in school. So the first problem is my child's school says they don't offer gluten-free food. So if your child attends a school that participates in the National School Lunch Program, and most public schools do, they are required by law to provide a gluten-free lunch for the child with celiac disease. So again, they have to offer the food. They can't say that they don't do it. But the reality is this oftentimes is a communication issue. School nurses and administrators are not well versed on what options are available to the school to offer. They're only well versed on what the school has traditionally offered in the past. So if they've never had to offer gluten-free options, they may not be ordering them from their food service vendor. And in that case, it may look like they don't have gluten-free offerings, but they certainly have access to quite a bit of gluten-free food. So it's important that you sit down with the head of nutrition services for your school district or the cafeteria manager at your particular school to talk about what options truly are available, and not just available today on the school menu, but what options are available from the food service vendor for the school to offer. My school's child says no to a 504 plan. If your child attends a school that receives federal funding, they're required to hold a 504 plan eligibility meeting. And that's the part where they go through the checklist that said, if your child meets this criteria, then they are eligible for a 504 plan. And if they do that, if they go through that criteria, they will determine that your child is eligible because celiac disease impacts major bodily functions, and that will make it qualified for a 504 plan. It's also important to remind your school that celiac disease is a disability, and the 504 plan is the most appropriate place for documenting the accommodations for that disability. My child keeps getting exposed to gluten at school. That can be a very frustrating experience. What you want to do is set up a meeting at your school with the 504 plan administrator, the school nurse, your classroom teacher, and the food service manager. Just a little aside here on what a 504 plan administrator is. Every school is required to have a 504 plan administrator. This is the person who oversees all of the 504 plans for the entire school. But this is not a job that someone has. This is like a hat that they wear in addition to another job that they do. So your 504 plan administrator may be the assistant principal, it may be the school nurse, it may be somebody else in the school. So it's important for you to know who that is at your school. And I would advise, if you don't know who that is, talk to your school nurse, because when doing 504 plans and setting up these accommodations, the school nurse is almost always involved in it. And oftentimes the school nurse is also the 504 plan administrator. But if they are not, they're going to know who is. So a great place to figure out who that person is with your school nurse. So you want to set up a meeting to clearly explain where and how your child is being exposed to gluten, and then come up with a plan and write it down, make sure everyone agrees to it, of what you're going to do going forward to make sure that those gluten exposures no longer happen. So, what happens if your child is in college or about to attend college or thinking about college? You're probably really worried about the fact that they're going to be living on campus. They're going to eat all of their meals in a cafeteria, and what kinds of things are going to be available to them. Well, first of all, no, college is possible for a child with celiac disease. We know many, many, many students who have very happy, wonderful college experiences and manage being gluten free just fine. The first thing you want to do to ensure that your child does have that happy, healthy college experience is meet with the Office of Disability Services. And you want to do this with schools that your child is seriously considering. Every school that's on your child's, if you've ever been through the college selection process, you know that there's like stages of there's 3,000 colleges and then 100 colleges and then 50 colleges. And then, you're going to get to that maybe 10 or 15 colleges that your child is really serious about. That's when you want to start thinking about food and celiac disease and what gluten-free options are available. And your first step in that process is contacting the Office of Disability Services. Once your child's applied and been accepted and selected the school that they're going to attend, you want to take your existing 504 plan and send that to the Office of Disability Services in order to get the process for accommodations in college started. Every year, the Society for the Study of Celiac Disease hosts a college summit. It's a great program, and I strongly encourage anyone who's about to enter college to attend that. It goes through a lot of information, not just about how to make sure you're getting the appropriate accommodations at school, which is, of course, very important, but just things about dealing with your health at school. For most students, when they enter college, they're now 18, they're adults. Your mom or dad is not going to be able to call your doctor's office in order to make your appointments or to get information or that kind of stuff for you. So, really, a lot of things that you need to consider just about taking care of your health when you're going to be away from home, as well as when you're going to be an adult and have more responsibilities for that than you have had in the past. Oh, in addition, on the College Summit, is a scholarship is usually awarded to one lucky student who attends through a raffle drawing. So another really good reason to incentivize you to come. But the information, you'll go away with wonderful information if you attend, whether you get the scholarship or not. Some of the accommodations you want to ask for in college are making sure that the gluten-free meals that are provided in the dining halls meet the same nutritional standards as the meals being offered to the other students. It's just like what we've been talking about in the younger grades. Allowing students with celiac disease to pre-order gluten-free meals. In a lot of school cafeterias, you go into the cafeteria and you go through a line sort of picking out the things that you want to eat. And then, at the end of the line, you go sit down and you eat your food. For the gluten-free meals, often they are prepared to order because they're not serving as many gluten-free options. So when you come into the cafeteria, you often have to go into a special line. You have to wait. You order your food. You have to wait for them to cook it. And by the time you get your food and go over to the table where all your friends who went through that regular line are sitting, they're done. They're ready to leave. And the time spent eating meals in the college cafeteria is a really important part of the social experience in college. So you want to make sure that you have that if you're a college student, and if you can pre-order your meal, so you go in that special line and then you just get that gluten-free meal, and you're sitting down at the table to eat, or just around the same time as all your friends are, is really important. Schools can label food so that you can easily identify what's gluten-free and even foods that have other common allergens. That makes it a lot easier for students with special diets to go through the cafeteria line. Adopting standard practices for the preparation of gluten-free food so it's free for cross-contact. Your college cafeteria should have those practices in place. Making sure that food service staff are trained on gluten-free food preparation. and providing a dedicated space in the main dining hall to store and prepare gluten-free foods. A lot of schools, school purchasing of specialty gluten-free products for students with celiac disease isn't a whole lot different than what we do at home. And that is, it costs them more money. So your college cafeteria isn't going to want to put all of that gluten-free food out for everybody to take. They're going to want to make sure that it's in a space where only students who need it are going to be the ones to access it. But you also want to make sure that your student has easy access to it in this dedicated space in the main dining hall so that, again, they're not waiting for a long time to get access to that gluten-free food. And you want to make sure that the vendors that your student can go to in addition to the main cafeteria on campus and use their dining dollars that's part of their meal plan, that those vendors accept those dining dollars have gluten-free options. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them should be able to provide gluten-free food for your student. And you want to make sure that the school allows for a refrigerator and microwave in your student's dorm room. Depending on where your child goes to school, but it is particularly prevalent here in the Northeast where I am, with older schools, with older buildings, with older electricity, that there are restrictions on having things like refrigerators and microwaves in your room. And you want to make sure that you get special permission to be able to have that because your child is probably going to want to supplement with food that they have available in their room. So what are your next steps? First, you want to reach out to your child's physician to secure your celiac diagnosis letter. This is the letter from your doctor that says your child has celiac disease and that they need to have a 504 plan at school. You want to review the booklet, Managing Celiac Disease in Learning Environments, and really focus on those pages 20 and 21 to think about the accommodations that your child needs. And again, if at all possible, engage your child in that process of looking at the accommodations. You want to connect with your school nurse or the administrator or the 504 plan coordinator in order to discuss setting up the 504 accommodation plan meeting. And if you need any help as you go through this process, there are lots of resources available to you on the CDF website. Just go to celiac.org. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Francie. That was amazing, as always, and just so grateful for all of your wonderful advice and suggestions. So we're going to move into the Q&A now, and I actually want to start with a question for Dr. Verma. This attendee says, my 14-year-old son gets sick very often, not only stomach issues, but catches every virus out there. He's already missed 10 days of school and it just started. I believe his immune system is compromised due to his disease. He eats healthy, gets adequate sleep, takes vitamins, but he's always sick. Is this something that a doctor can add into the 504 plan letter? It's affecting his grades.
So I also want to thank Francie for always having a fantastic presentation. And even though I must have heard this a zillion times, I always learn something new. So thank you. And then for this parent, I am sorry that your child is going through all this. It's tough when you have a child with one illness and you are doing the appropriate in terms of diet, gluten-free foods, and everything else, and the child is still sick. So a couple of questions. I think from an immune system standpoint and celiac disease, when you're just diagnosed with celiac disease and for the first couple of years, your immune system is compromised. But once you've been on a gluten-free diet and you've been, your blood tests in terms of your panels, antibodies, and all those are normal and you're staying away from gluten, your immune system should start coming back to almost a normal one. So what I would urge you to do is, first of all, depending on how long your child has had celiac disease for and where we are in the control of celiac disease, if it's under good control, then please review with your clinical team and make sure there's nothing else going on. So it's very important to remember that there are other things that can happen besides celiac disease, and we need to look at those, make sure the vaccines are happening and so on in terms of normal sort of flu and pneumonias and all those vaccines that are occurring. So if your child has just been diagnosed, then yes, your doctor could put that in that there might be some accommodations that might need to be made, but I really think from a celiac standpoint, you need to go back to your clinical team and say, is this truly all celiac related or not? So I always say, don't always blame everything on celiac disease because there are other things that can happen as well. So the only accommodation from a celiac standpoint that can be made is if it's the diagnosis was just made. But otherwise, please follow up with your clinical team to make sure nothing else is going on with your child.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. Megan, would you be able to answer the question about certified gluten-free versus not certified gluten-free?
Yes, so there really is no difference. Certified products are verified by a third party, but there is no standardization in terms of what that means. So a product that says gluten-free has to adhere to the same FDA standard of under 20 parts per million as a product that is not certified. So really, there is no difference. It just, if you see the words gluten-free, legally, it means the same thing.
And just remember that the only term that's regulated on any of the packages is gluten-free or free from gluten or no gluten-containing ingredients. That's the part that's actually regulated, not the word certified. Okay, so I think this is for Francie, but anyone is welcome to jump in. We had an instance where the science classroom my son had his science period in was contaminated with wheat flour, and immediately prior class had used wheat flour for a science activity, and it was all over the desks and in the air. What is a good 504 accommodation to account for something like this?
So that's a really tough one because it is really likely that whoever was running the class that created the problem was not necessarily in tune to the 504 plan for the child who wasn't in their classroom. Like, we have an expectation that our teachers are going to make appropriate accommodations for our kids. And here's one where, it was not your child's teacher, it was not your child's class that caused the problem. So it is important to have in your 504 plan the fact that the school is going to provide a environment that is safe for your child. And that would cover being in a science classroom whose previous class had made this mess. But I would say in that case, or maybe news to me and for everyone else who are on this call, making sure that the school is well aware that making sure that the classroom is clean and safe for your child with celiac disease is going to extend to other uses of that classroom, whether it's other classes doing activities in there, they need to be activities that can be quickly and easily cleaned up, or whether it's a lot of our schools are used as community centers. So it could be a community group that was in there in the evening that made a mess, and you want to make sure that things are properly cleaned before school starts the next day. So I think that is something for, just the broad statement in the plan that the school needs to be clean, but taking it up with the school administrators to make sure that all teachers in all classes, not just the one with the child with celiac disease in it, are aware and taking appropriate precautions.
So this actually reminds me of when we had the whole explosion of the moldy bread experiments, when all of these schools were having kids take wheat bread and rub them on different surfaces. So historically, they had used cotton balls or like little pieces of cotton to rub on like toilet seats or door handles and then rub them in the petri dishes. And they switched a few years back to using wheat bread to do this. And so they were looking at how quickly the mold grew on pieces of bread. And so kids with celiac were coming home saying like, oh my goodness, there's been bread rubbed all over my chair and my desk and everywhere I am. And so it is a responsibility of the school to clean in between periods, and especially when there is a product being used that is unsafe for a child in the class. And so there has been a really big move away from the moldy bread project, as there should be as well, with an entire classroom being contaminated with flour. I think it's well within your rights to ask for it to be cleaned before your child is in that space. Okay, so there are so many good questions, and we're just going to spend a few more minutes getting to as many as we can. So my daughter is in second grade, and the district mentioned we would have to prove her disease substantially limits one or more major life activities. They were obviously reluctant to set up the eligibility meeting, and I started second guessing myself on if the 504 plan was necessary. And am I justified in requesting it? Francie, do you want to start out with that?
I would say you're absolutely justified in requesting it. So that's the most important thing here. And that is really why we have the diagnosis letter from the doctor. It doesn't just identify that your child has celiac disease, but you want that note to include in it information about some of the specific types of accommodations that would be necessary for a child with celiac disease. They don't have to list every single accommodation you're going to put in the 504 plan in that diagnosis letter, but broad brush strokes in terms of the kinds of things that need to be in place in a school environment for a child with celiac disease. And again, that letter should also indicate that celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, and it does impact major life activities in specific ways. And that would make it very clear to the school that your child is eligible.
And Megan or Emily, if you could drop the link to the sample diagnosis letter in the chat for everyone, just so that they have a copy of that. Also, just in regards to your eligibility question, so anyone who gets a 504 plan by law has to go through an eligibility meeting, hearing. They call it different things depending on the school. And you do need to, there'll be two questions asked. So the form that they submit to the government, you have two questions. The first is, what is the disability that your child has? And you would answer celiac disease. And the second question is, how does this substantially limit one or more major life activities? And the answer is eating, digestion, immune function. If your child has headaches, neurological symptoms, you only need to answer one. You don't need to have a whole laundry list of them. You can just say eating, and that is a major life function that it impacts. And that qualifies your child for the 504 plan. I know that this process, I have an 11-year-old with celiac disease. I've gone through this myself, and it was very intimidating and scary being asked those questions in an official setting, and it never feels good. But truthfully, those are the answers that you need to give, and they must qualify you based upon that.
And I'd just like to add here one
Yeah.
thing. If, the 504 is not just for the food and the meal. So even if your child does not want to have a lunch from school, please apply for that 504. Whether you use it or not, it's only going to help your child with the accommodation. So it's not just for that meal or just for that lunch. I think some people just feel like, if my child is not going to eat lunch in school, why should I have a 504? So it's really important to just go ahead and proceed with that 504.
All right, Megan, does cross-contamination matter for all people with celiac, or is it based on severity by individual?
So yes, it matters for all individuals with celiac disease. Unfortunately, symptoms are not a good indicator of severity of disease. And so, yes, every person with celiac disease needs to be mindful of cross-contamination.
Thank you, Megan. My child would be going to kindergarten next fall. When is the appropriate time to submit a 504 plan request? Francie,
So
you take that one because I know you have strong feelings.
So that's a really tough question. So, sometime in the spring, I know when my daughter started kindergarten, it was called Kindergarten Roundup. There's some sort of like open house thing where the kids who are going to be coming into kindergarten the next fall get to come to the school and kind of, get familiarized with the school environment. That is the point in time where you want to reach out to the school to ask them what their process is. And ideally, you want to sit down with them at that time and set up all your accommodations so that when your child walks into school on the first day, everything's going to be taken care of. But realistically, the school is not going to want to sit down and work on the 504 plan with you until they know who the classroom teacher is, until they know, who that teacher is that's going to have that overall responsibility for your child and for implementing and ensuring that this plan is in place. And that usually doesn't happen until sometime in August. So again, ideally would love to do this in the spring so your child walks into school on the first day and all your ducks are in a row. But that's just not how it happens in most cases. In most cases, it's going to be, sometime either right before school starts during that sort of teacher um, work week or weeks, depending on your school district, or it's going to be into that first month of school. And that's really hard, especially with a little one who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience with the diet, as well as experience in a school setting. And it's very nerve-wracking for you as a parent. But that is why it happens. But if you talk to them early about it, hopefully you will be one of the early 504 plans that they work on.
So when my son was going into kindergarten and we did the registration, we let them know at the time of registration that he had celiac disease and that he would need a 504 plan. And when we went to our registration appointment, they actually put they had like a sticker that said needs appointment on it. And that flagged for them that at the beginning of the school year, we were going to have a meeting. And they actually called us to come in and meet the week before school started. And so that was like great that we got to like sit down with his teacher before school started and talk about it. The only thing that I would give as a recommendation is that when my son went through this, they didn't actually tell the teacher that he had celiac disease until that meeting. And so she was like, I wish I had known 2 weeks ago because I would have just ordered, like, they get a catalog where they can order their stuff from. And she's like, I would have just ordered the gluten-free Play-Doh for the whole classroom as opposed to ordering the Play-Doh that she did. She's like, it wasn't a difference in price even. And she's like, I just didn't know. And so I would recommend that as soon as you find out who your classroom teacher is, letting them know, because you will likely know your teacher before you have that meeting, and it can really help them with setting up the classroom in a different way just by knowing that they need to. Okay, I'm going to do one more question because we are way over time now. First of all, Nicole would like Dr. Verma to know that she is sending warm regards that you diagnosed her daughter. So thank you for that kind message for Dr. Verma. Last question though. My daughter is a junior in high school, doesn't currently have a 504 plan. We were not planning on getting one for her, but wondering if she should get it in order to better accommodate in college.
So I would say yes. And I would say yes, not just for college, although I think that is important. I mean, in my experience working with lots of students, um, having that 504 plan that you from high school that you can give the college when you first walk in to talk to the Office of Disability Services, like half the work is done because they already know they're going to need to make accommodations because that's in place. So I think that would be an important reason. But in general, lots of kids can go through school without a 504 plan in place and not have any issues. And lots of kids go through school with a 504 plan in place and never have any issues that really we have to go back to the plan for. But it has been my experience working with lots of families is that you don't need the 504 plan until you need it. And at that point, it's too late to put it in place. So maybe there's going to be a senior trip next year. And the tour company for that trip to France or wherever it happens to be that senior trip is, says, no, we can't accommodate the gluten-free diet. If you have a 504 plan in place, then all of a sudden now there's a legal obligation involved. That wouldn't be if you didn't have that 504 plan in place. And so just even though you're very close to the end, you can see the graduation in your sights by having a child who's a junior, something could still happen in the next 2 years that would make that 504 plan important even in high school. So I would highly recommend that you do that for that reason, as well as the smoother transition into college.
All right. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining today. And thank you so much to all of the mentors who are here. We really, truly appreciate you. We hope that this has been helpful for everyone. Again, the recording of this session will be available on the Celiac Disease Foundation YouTube channel. And thank you all for coming today. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.